In the first scene, we see a woman drawing medicine into a syringe and giving an injection to a man. Events unfold shortly after the end of World War II. Private Detective Charles Hayward visited a cinema where a story about the passing of Aristide Leonidas, the richest man in England, was shown. His first wife passed away young, and Mr. Leonidas remarried an American widow named Brenda. Soon Aristide's eldest granddaughter Sophia, whom the detective knew personally, came to Charles's office. He expressed his condolences. Sophia is here because she suspects that her grandfather's demise was not due to a heart attack but a crime. And Sophia wants Charles Hayward to investigate this case. Charles is not sure it's a good idea. He and Sophia had met before in Egypt when Charles was still a fledgling diplomat, but then the girl simply disappeared without explanation. Sophia said that she only wanted to keep him away from her family, but now everything has changed. Moreover, Sophia is convinced that the person who took her grandfather's life is living in the house, so she's afraid. Charles still refused Sophia, advising her to go to the police. The girl had to leave. Charles's secretary, an elderly woman, told him he shouldn't have turned down such a job because it was his chance to make a name for himself. Besides, Charles isn't doing so well financially right now. In the end, Charles decided to take on the investigation and studied the family doctor's report on the Leonidas family, learning that Aristide's demise was likely caused by a drops called azirin. If the drops are used intravenously, it can lead to a heart attack. Since Aristide suffered from diabetes, Chief Inspector Taverner speculated that someone may have substituted insulin with azirin. Or perhaps it was just a coincidence? Charles isn't sure if this investigation will make sense, as the aristocratic Leonidas family is unlikely to be forthcoming with him. Aristide was a contradictory figure, with many influential friends and enemies. Charles often recalls the happy days spent with Sophia in Egypt. Back then, Charles thought it was the love of his life. The next day, he headed to the wealthy estate of the Leonidas family. The magnificent mansion resembled more of a royal palace. Charles saw Lady Edith de Havilland practicing shooting in the courtyard, whose late sister was Aristide's first wife. Edith has a large collection of weapons and poisons that she uses to deter moles on the estate. Their conversation was interrupted by the screams of a nanny trying to persuade young Josephine to get down from the treehouse. Sophia came out to greet Charles. She's very glad he's here. Sophia showed the detective the house, telling him that Aunt Edith moved here many years ago to take care of the ailing grandmother. Edith and Leonidas had tense relations. They were constantly arguing. Leading the detective into her grandfather's room, Sophia recounted how on that fateful morning, she brought him breakfast as usual, only to find him lifeless. According to Sophia, she and the grandfather always got along very well. Charles asked Sophia why during the last meeting, she had said she was scared. The girl replied that their family had many oddities. There is something violent in each of them. Sophia left to not disturb the detective in his work. Charles inspected Aristide's personal bathroom and his room. Suddenly Josephine, Sophia's younger sister, approached him and said she loves reading detective stories because the culprit always turns out to be the one the reader least suspects. Later, Charles conversed with Magda, Josephine and Sophia's mother, who is a theater actress. Besides her daughters, she has a middle son Eustace. She behaved rather frivolously, sipping champagne and saying that Leonidas's demise would give her good publicity. After that, Charles went to the library to question Magda's husband, Philip Leonidas. Obviously Philip was not pleased with a private detective in their home, but if the police come, it will be even worse. That's why he agreed to answer questions. Philip is Aristide Leonidas's eldest son and is an historian by education. He studies the Middle Ages and wasn't particularly involved in his father's business. But Philip's younger brother Roger is an important figure. Aristide's will has not been disclosed yet, and Charles said he would like to see it. Philip assured that the father's entire estate would be divided equally among his heirs, so the detective wouldn't hear anything interesting. Charles found it strange that Philip didn't seem upset, even though his father had passed away. Philip made it clear that he wasn't going to explain anything. Charles wanted to speak with Lady Edith, but she was busy planning to trim the bushes in the garden. Next, Charles interviewed Clemency Leonidas. She is a chemist specializing in poisons derived from plants. Clemency is Roger's wife, who believes that Edith is the one who took Leonidas' life. Roger is the managing director of one of his father's companies. Charles asked him questions, but Roger didn't answer, continuing to accuse Edith. Clemency hurriedly led the detective out of the room, saying that her husband is not himself with grief. Roger was the father's favorite and is deeply affected by his loss. There is also a nanny in the house who also performs housekeeping duties. There is also a cook in the house, and the rest of the servants come and go. Seeing a certain man, Charles asked the nanny who he was. She replied that he was Mr. Brown, the children's teacher. Finally, the detective spoke with Brenda Leonidas, the widow. She is only 37, much younger than Aristide. But Brenda claimed that their marriage was for love. Charles asked her about the acquaintance with Aristide. Brenda said she was a dancer in Las Vegas. Once Aristide walked into the casino, saw her crying and began to comfort her. This casino belonged to Aristide, but Brenda didn't know that at the time. She had always dreamed of a man who would take care of her and provide a luxurious life, and she found one. When Brenda mentioned that Aristide was writing memoirs, and in connection with it, was in frequent communication with Lawrence Brown, the children's teacher, this intrigued Charles. The detective also asked Brenda about the insulin. She didn't hide that she gave the husband an injection that evening because he asked her to, but Brenda swore that she didn't switch the medication. Charles recalls 18 months ago in Cairo when he spoke with a man who was very interested in Aristide Leonides's identity. There is information that Leonides has been working for the CIA in recent years. Some want to ensure that the visit of Leonides's granddaughter to Cairo, who arrived under a false name, is just a coincidence and nothing else. At that time, Charles was working at the embassy and was assigned to spy on Sophia. In the present, Charles found Mr. Brown in Aristide's office. Mr. Brown assured that Leonides had given him access here since they started working on his memoirs. Lawrence talked about Aristide's grandson. Eustace is a rebellious teenager. Aristide feared that his peers would tease Eustace because of his limp, so the young man was homeschooled. According to Lawrence, a day before the tragedy, Aristide met with Roger, who was having business problems, with Magda, who asked for funding for her first film and was refused, and with Sophia, who seemed the most secretive of them. When Charles asked Lawrence to provide him with the memoirs, he said that the only copy had disappeared. While Edith was shooting again, Charles reflected. Josephine approached the detective again and said he was lucky that the family members agreed to talk to him because they usually talk rarely. Josephine is not very upset about losing her grandfather because he didn't allow her to pursue ballet. When the detective asked Josephine about Mr. Brown, she said he has an affair with Brenda and they supposedly write letters to each other. Hearing this, Charles was shocked. Josephine knows a lot because none of the family members pay attention to her, while she pays attention to everyone. Finally, Charles was able to have a conversation with Edith and directly asked what was wrong with the inhabitants of the house. Edith replied that each of them carefully hides their vices, then simply walked away. In the evening, Charles left the cottage, unable to stop thinking that someone from the Leonides family was involved in the terrible crime. At some point, Charles noticed a car following him. When he stopped, the car turned around and drove in the opposite direction. So who is the culprit? Maybe Magda, or perhaps Brenda? Everyone in this house has a motive. At night, Charles called his influential friend and asked him to find any information about Aristide Leonides. When Charles returned home, he saw Sophia near his apartment, who offered him a ride on a motorcycle through the nighttime streets. They had a great time, stopping at a bar. As it turned out from their conversation, Sophia dreamed of becoming a ballerina in childhood, and unlike her younger sister had talent for it, but a knee injury dashed her plans. Now Charles and Sophia felt passion for each other, just like in Cairo 18 months ago. However, Charles cannot fully trust Sophia, nor can he trust her entire family. The next day, the notary allowed Charles to review Aristide's will, which divided his estate equally among all the heirs. But the thing is, the will does not bear a signature, although Mr. Gateskill was sure that Aristide had signed it. Thus this will has no legal force, and therefore the widow of Aristide automatically becomes the owner of the entire estate. While Josephine was practicing ballet on her own, Charles immediately arrived at Roger's office, who was already aware of the problems with the will. Charles hinted that he knew about Roger's company being on the verge of bankruptcy. Roger showed the detective a check for a very large sum that he received from his father on the eve of the tragic event. The father had always bailed Roger out, which displeased his wife. That evening, Clemency told Roger to tear up the check and never ask his father for money again. The next morning, Aristide passed away. Roger tore up the check in front of the detective. The nanny noticed Josephine spying on the other inhabitants of the house and scolded her. The girl was very offended. From his influential friend, Charles learned that he was being surveilled. The friend shared information that Leonides had assisted intelligence services during the Greek Civil War, financing anti-communist organizations. Obviously, there were many people who wished Aristide harm. To find out more, Charles and his friend right in the car attacked the man who was spying on the detective. His name is Sergeant Glover. It turned out that Glover had been hired by the chief inspector, who was concerned that all this investigation was related to politics. Charles stated that anyone from the family members could be guilty because each of them had a motive. In the detective's opinion, intelligence agencies and foreign enemies of Aristide have nothing to do with this. Taverner ordered Charles to return to the Leonides house and find the culprit. Charles did just that and talked to Sophia. It turned out that everyone in the house knew about the effect of the eye drops on the heart. For some time, Aristide himself had jokingly suggested this idea to the family members. Sophia had also long suspected Brenda and Brown's affair. Presumably Aristide was aware of it too, but did not interfere because he wanted his wife to be happy. Later, Josephine approached the detective again and said that he wouldn't solve this case. The girl also claimed that she hadn't seen any letters from Mr. Brown to Brenda and had actually made it all up out of boredom. The detective didn't believe Josephine. Before leaving, she said that there would be another crime so that whoever knew the truth wouldn't reveal the secret. This is usually how it happens in classic detective stories. Finally, Charles came to interrogate Eustace, who clearly wasn't in the mood to talk. Obviously, Eustace was also aware of Brenda and Lawrence's affair. Eustace doesn't believe that Brenda committed the crime because she isn't smart enough. Someone could have framed her. Charles came to Clemency again, asking if Brenda's appearance had caused discord in their family. This time Clemency answered the questions reluctantly. When the detective began to inquire about her husband's business problems, she kicked him out of the room. Sophia burned the grandfather's memoirs, assuring the detective that it contained nothing about the crime. Of course, Charles didn't believe her. Sophia said that the memoirs contained some political moments that could discredit their family. Sophia had to take care of their overall reputation first and foremost. Charles couldn't get his car started, so Sophia offered him to stay at their house for the night. Charles joined the family members for dinner. Mr. Brown was also present. At first they engaged in ordinary small talk, but then Edith asked the detective what he thought the perpetrator he was looking for looked like. Charles replied that each of them fit the description of a potential criminal. Philip openly began to censure Brenda for not even attending the funeral. Brenda said she couldn't bear it, but no one at the table believed the sincerity of the widow, given her affair with Brown. Suddenly Clemency announced that she and Roger were planning to leave soon. They wanted to be as far away from their crazy family as possible. Philip had always envied his younger brother, wondering why their father loved him more, considering he wasn't succeeding in business. Eustace suggested that maybe Sophia hadn't hired the detective randomly. What if she was trying to deflect suspicion from herself? After dinner, Brenda came to Charles's room, saying that family members were now turning against both of them. Charles advised her to stay calm and avoid talking to the press. Sophia saw them together and misunderstood the situation, promptly firing Charles. Hearing fast footsteps, Charles followed Josephine, who was conducting her own investigation. Climbing into the treehouse, Charles watched through binoculars as Brenda and Brown drank and danced, not in the least bit grieving for Aristide. As Charles prepared to descend, aggressive dogs surrounded the tree. In the morning, news that Aristide Leonidas' demise wasn't of natural causes leaked to the press and caused a sensation. The family members were contemplating their next steps. Charles, who had been in the war many years before, remained calm. The others were in turmoil, even Edith. The house was constantly receiving calls from reporters. The mechanic fixed Charles's car, so he could leave. Chief Inspector Taverner urgently demanded a meeting with him. Mr. Agrodopoulos, who had previously worked in intelligence services and was Aristide's confidant, was summoned for questioning. Mr. Agrodopoulos was the one to whom Leonidas entrusted an envelope containing a new will, stating that a small portion of the money would go to the widow, while the rest of the estate would go to his granddaughter, Sophia. Detectives were informed that someone had attempted to harm Josephine in the Leonidas house. The detectives immediately went there. It turned out that someone had cut the rope in the treehouse. Josephine lost consciousness and doesn't remember anything. Eustace claimed to have seen Charles climbing into the treehouse yesterday. It was Eustace who let the dogs down, thinking it suspicious. In the house, Charles found Edith looking for something at the crime scene. She made it clear that she didn't have to explain anything. Charles has no idea who in this house is hiding the dreadful truth. Mr. Gateskill, the notary, arrived and congratulated Sophia, who had now become a very wealthy woman. Clemency and Roger are the only relatives of Sophia who don't covet her money. Philip feels humiliated, not understanding why his father left everything to the granddaughter instead of him, the eldest son. Sophia feels guilty towards her father. Charles directly asked Sophia if she had originally known about the will. She didn't hesitate to admit that she did. This is why she hurriedly left Cairo 18 months ago. The grandfather asked her to return to teach her how to manage his empire. Sophia also knows that Charles was spying on her in Cairo, which broke her heart. A secreter belonging to Lady Edith was found under the treehouse, but according to Charles this proves nothing. Anyone could have taken the secreter. The chief inspector intended to personally continue the investigation because Charles's friendship with Sophia makes him biased. While Brenda and Brown remain the prime suspects, newly discovered letters have confirmed this. It turns out Josephine wasn't making anything up. In her letters, Brenda wrote that she wanted Aristide to disappear. The chief inspector caught Brenda in her room dancing and announced that she was under arrest. Brenda claimed she didn't write those letters, but all the evidence was against her. The other family members openly gloated while Brenda cried out that someone framed her. Brown had also been arrested by then. In a fit of anger, Roger took Brenda's portrait and stomped on it. Edith intends to hire the best lawyer for Brenda, believing that she didn't realize what she was doing. Charles still doesn't believe Brenda is involved in this. Someone could have forged those letters, including Sophia. Photos of Brenda and Brown made it into all the newspapers. Thanks to this case, Charles became famous. Josephine was finally discharged from the hospital. Sophia was happy to see her younger sister. Josephine seemed surprised to learn that the letters had become the main evidence. Charles was filling out reports while Josephine searched everywhere for her diary, which had gone missing. The girl was sure the nanny took it. Lady Edith consulted a doctor and learned she was terminally ill. She had only a few months left to live. Charles stayed in his office late. Josephine was upset that she still hadn't found her diary. Sophia promised they would find it together. Meanwhile, Philip put on a record, thinking about something of his own. Edith cried in her car, and Josephine danced ballet in front of her grandfather's portrait. Charles fell asleep right in the office and received a call in the morning. The nanny was found lifeless in the Leonides house. It was evidently poisoning. Roger and Clemency were late for the airport, but the chief inspector ordered them to stay until the investigation was completed. Josephine didn't seem upset at all. The girl didn't hide that she never liked the nanny because she was always scolding her. The detective suspected Josephine was hiding something and spoke with her alone, despite her parents' protests. However, Josephine was very stubborn and refused to say anything. Charles never got anything out of her. The coroner speculated that judging by all the symptoms, cyanide was mixed into the hot chocolate. Charles remembered that cyanide was used to get rid of moles, but he didn't get a chance to talk to Edith because she had already left with Josephine. On the way out of the gate she lied to the sergeant that she was taking Josephine away from here on an inspector's errand. In the shed in the garden, Charles found cyanide, as well as Josephine's diary hidden in the lime. Obviously Edith wanted to destroy the diary because it contained evidence. In his car, Charles found a letter from Edith. He and Josephine hurried to catch up with Edith. In her letter, Edith confessed that she had taken the life of Aristide Leonides. Unable to hold back tears, Edith told Josephine that they were going to a ballet lesson, as she had always dreamed of. Charles doesn't believe Edith did it, and Josephine's diary confirmed that. It turns out the girl was bored, so she decided to get rid of her grandfather first and then the nanny. Edith wanted to take the blame, knowing she didn't have long to live anyway. Furthermore, Josephine copied Brenda's handwriting to frame her. To divert suspicion, the girl faked her fall from the treehouse. Sophia and Charles caught up with Edith's car, but noticing them she increased speed, and along with Josephine veered off the quarry. This way she rid the world of Josephine and ensured that Brenda and Brown were acquitted. An explosion occurred. Sophia cried, and Charles comforted her. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.